A small town is rattled when a wealthy couple mysteriously disappears.
They had a family business. They were very successful, and they earned it.
They are not the type of people who would vanish in thin air.
Had the couple been targeted for their wealth?
There was a big chunk of money there, and then you wonder if one of the two of them did something and left.
It isn't long before evidence suggests an even deadlier crime.
At least 2 shots were fired. When he went to scoop up a pile of leaves, he saw bones.
The search for the truth will unravel a conspiracy of deception and expose the lengths 2 desperate people would go to get what they desire.
They're motivated by greed. They're motivated by love.
It was just absolutely horrifying and intentional and cruel that that could come from somebody that was filled with such bountiful good. Unfathomable.
Fairfield County, Connecticut is an affluent bedroom community north of New York City, where residents enjoy the peace and quiet.
It's very old-time Americana. It's almost like Mayberry in a way.
For Jeffrey and Jeanette Naven, it was the ideal place to build their garbage pickup company, J&J Refuse.
Jeffrey and Jeanette had a family-run small business involving picking up refuse in several of the towns in Fairfield County.
That was not a glamorous business, but it was an honest, hard-working business at which they succeeded and excelled. And through that, they earned, on a harder path than most, a highly respected position in a community that tends to be a more professional, white-collar community.
Jeanette did like the bookkeeping for J&J. She was employed outside that business where she worked in the Weston school system.
She was in the library whenever I would go in, and she was a busy bee, but she would always take time to chat. She was very outgoing and friendly.
Jeffrey and Jeanette had 2 sons, Kyle and Taylor.
Family was really important to him, and Jeanette. They were very involved in their church. They were very involved in their children.
In high school, Jeffrey and Jeanette encouraged their sons to participate in competitive sports, and both boys excelled.
All 3 of my sons played ice hockey, so I knew them through high school boys ice hockey. And they were always present, always supportive. Kyle was the hero of the team. He was the only goaltender. In fact, when I first met Jeff, it was down, standing as goaltender fathers do, at the end of the ice.
After high school, the Naven's youngest son attended college in Mississippi and pursued a career in golf. Kyle stayed in Connecticut and joined his parents' trash pickup business.
Their business essentially consisted of a 2-truck operation, one operated by Jeff and one by their son, Kyle.
The Naven's success eventually allowed Jeffrey and Jeanette to purchase a $1.3 million, 8,000-square-foot mansion in Fairfield County. The couple also bought their son Kyle his own house in the nearby town of Bridgeport, where he lived with his girlfriend, Jennifer Valiente.
Jennifer's family came from Westport as well, and they were longtime residents there.
After Kyle and Jennifer graduated, the high school sweethearts began to build a life together in their new home.
They had 2 Rottweilers, and they loved the dogs. And they would drive around together with the dogs in the garbage truck. They were happy.
In the spring of 2015, with both sons grown and settled, Jeffrey and Jeanette began planning for their own future.
They had sold their house. They rented the smaller house in Easton, I think with the anticipation of retiring, within a year or 2's time.
But on the morning of August 7th, 2015, the Naven's plan for the future would come to an abrupt halt when Easton police receive an ominous report from Jeffrey Naven's sister, Laura Thompson.
Laura Thompson comes into the Easton Police Department to file a report that she has not heard or seen from her brother, Jeffrey, or her sister-in-law, Jeanette Navin, for 3 days.
Jeffrey runs a refuse company, and when the garbage is not collected on a regular basis, the customers aren't happy, and they voice their concern.
What was told to me by Laura was that he never missed a route, and if they were to go on vacation or go away in some manner, that either his son Kyle would cover the route, or he'd find another person or another way to cover that route.
Jeffrey's sister tells police that Kyle was the last person to see his parents 3 days earlier.
They had been calling Jeffrey and Jeanette's phones, and they were finding that their phones were turned off. When you find a phone that's off consistently for a period of days, inexplicably, that's another red flag.
That afternoon, Easton police dispatch an officer to the Naven's house for a wellness check.
I just wanted to do a well check on the house just to make sure they weren't inside and were injured. When I went in, I entered the kitchen. I observed that there was a couple of dishes in the sink, nothing messy. The house was kept well, nothing out of place. There was a to-do list on the refrigerator. It was unplug a couple things, make sure to unplug the dehumidifier, turn off the lights, things of that nature.
Initially, we were thinking that this may be a vacation list. If you're going on vacation, these are the things you want to do before you go on vacation.
On one of the day planners that they had circled a bunch of dates for baseball games that they wanted to go to, one of being in Detroit. And one of the dates was during the time that we were looking at them.
Maybe they went away, they forgot to tell someone to run the routes.
When I went upstairs, I noticed that the house continued to be clean. There was nothing to indicate that there was a struggle or anything nefarious that had happened.
Outside, police note that one of the Naven's personal vehicles is missing.
From what Laura Thompson had said, that there was another vehicle that was not in the driveway at the time.
Jeanette Naven's Dodge pickup truck was not at the residence.
We put out information on the two people that were missing, as well as the color, the VIN number, plate number on that car to surrounding counties.
Investigators next reach out to Jeffrey and Jeanette's 27-year-old son, Kyle Naven. Kyle tells police that the last time he spoke with his parents was the night before they disappeared.
Kyle Naven indicated to Detective Lyman that his parents had come by his residence on Aldine Avenue in Bridgeport on Tuesday, the 4th of August.
They visited him at home and asked him to go to dinner that night. He said no, his back was hurting too much, and he told me that they had told him they were thinking of going to New York City to have dinner that night. He also said that's not unusual, that they often go away for short periods of time.
With no other leads to chase, investigators contact the couple's cell phone provider.
We did what's called an ex parte search warrant for their cell phone, which just gives us basic subscriber information and what the status of their phones are and when the last time it was used.
The phones were turned off, we discovered, which was disturbing.
Both of them went off the grid, off the network on the 4th of August. Jeanette's was early in the morning at 9:20, and Jeffrey's was at 1:23 in the afternoon.
I don't know anybody that owns a business that turns their phone off for 3 or 4 days, doesn't check in. Highly unusual for them in particular, and really in our current society for anybody to turn their phone off for 3 to 4 days.
Coming up, as police search for the missing couple, new evidence suggests a possible motive.
There was a big chunk of money there. We had some people saying, I hope Jeff didn't do something to Jeanette.
And a witness comes forward with a disturbing story.
He was out of sorts. He was yelling. They never saw him so angry. And then he says, "You're setting me up."
Police in Easton, Connecticut are searching for local business owners Jeffrey and Jeanette Naven, who seemingly disappeared on August 4th, 2015.
If you're running a family business of that scale, you don't just disappear. That just can't happen. And so I thought it could be something else, that it could be a serious illness in the family. If they had heard of somebody in need, they would have dropped everything and gone, which would have been characteristic of Jeff and Jeanette. And that was kind of like, it must be something like that.
But 72 hours after the couple was reported missing, a Connecticut state trooper makes an ominous discovery.
Trooper John Ring, during a patrol check of the exit 42 commuter lot in Westport, located Jeanette's Dodge pickup truck parked in the lot. The vehicle had sustained a broken window and was vandalized. We conducted a canvass of the area, and during the canvass of the area, there was an abandoned house across the street from the commuter lot in which we found J&J business cards.
Police recognized the name on the card as the Naven's company.
We did execute a search warrant of that abandoned property, and we found indicators that some of the items from that truck had been brought over to that house and had been just essentially discarded there.
But where are Jeanette and Jeffrey Naven now?
The last contact that anybody had was on the 4th with Jeffrey and Jeanette Naven. If there was foul play in play here, there was a 3 to 4 day head start.
As time ticks on, the danger increases of them losing their lives.
That's when we notified the press. What we're trying to do is follow everything up and see where they were prior to leaving. And that's a lot of legwork.
People that you knew were all of a sudden, on television, and something bad was going on. It's surreal. Everything was abuzz. And friends and people in the community were calling each other right away.
They are not the type of people who would vanish in thin air, who would just take off.
That's when we started getting a lot more information from people who are friendly with the Navens.
On August 10th, investigators get a promising new lead when the weighmaster of a Westport trash facility comes forward with new information.
The Navens were operating using smaller garbage trucks, and they would routinely go to the Westport transfer station, which is right off exit 18 in Westport.
The operator recalls seeing Jeffrey there on August 4th.
He stated to me that he did see Mr. Jeffrey Naven pull in. He noted at the time when he pulled in, he was on his cell phone. He appeared agitated and he was yelling on his phone at the time.
He was out of sorts. He was yelling, and it was something they'd never seen before. That they never saw him so angry or so irate.
Investigators wonder if Jeffrey's call could be related to trouble with the Naven's business. To find out, they subpoena the Naven's bank records.
Was there financial difficulties? What is the reason for their disappearance? Did they make a large withdrawal? Are they in debt? We discovered that they were going to sell their business. They had just sold a house in Weston, downsized for the purposes of getting their finances in order and selling the business, preparing to retire.
There was a big chunk of money there. And then you wonder if one of the two of them did something and left. We had some people saying, I hope Jeff didn't do something to Jeanette and take the money and run.
On August 12, 2015, authorities in Easton, Connecticut are searching for Jeffrey and Jeanette Naven when they learn the couple was sitting on a sizable nest egg.
But they had just sold a house in Weston, so it didn't sound like they were in any great financial stress.
We had some people saying, I hope Jeff didn't do something to Jeanette and take the money and run.
But that theory is quickly dispelled.
I did a search warrant which determined there was no money being withdrawn or deposited.
As the following days went on, there was no activity on any bank accounts or credit cards.
Family members insist that financial issues were not a factor in the couple's disappearance. In fact, they were both looking forward to retirement. But as investigators continue to speak with friends and associates, they notice a common theme. The Navins were determined to sell their business instead of leaving it to their son, Kyle.
We talked to two good friends of Jeanette Navin, and they were both consistent with saying that they were having an issue with Kyle.
Jeanette Navin had indicated to some of her friends that she believed he was using drugs.
During his hockey career, he sustained a legitimate back injury. And as a result of that back injury, he was prescribed at some point OxyContin for painkilling purposes. And unfortunately, he went down a road which many people in the United States find themselves in, where pain medication leads to abuse of pain medication, which leads to abuse of other drugs.
He had this drug issue that his parents did not want to support, and he had a girlfriend that his parents apparently did not approve of.
Kyle had a drug addiction. This drug addiction was in some degree managed by Jennifer, who would give him pain medications.
According to friends, Jeffrey and Jeanette worried for their oldest son, who had become increasingly irresponsible.
Kyle was taking time off, missing the route, and then his mother would have to do the route. The father was a hardworking man who took his job very seriously, and I think that's where the frustrations came with his son.
They bought him a house, trying to get him set up on his own. You know, how many parents buy their child a house?
They're trying to help him, but it's that line between helping and enabling is so fine.
Friends tell police that eventually Jeffrey and Jeanette took a tougher approach to dealing with Kyle.
They felt enough was enough. They were going to retire in a year. They were going to kind of sell the business, and at that point, Kyle was on his own.
Investigators theorize that if Kyle knew his parents were going to cut him off, he might have been involved in their disappearance.
Chief Shaw and myself called Kyle and asked him to come in for an interview because we wanted to ask him some further questions.
Let's go over this one more time, make sure you didn't miss something.
When Kyle sits down with investigators, he quickly volunteers new details about the day his parents disappeared.
One of the important things that came out of this interview was that Kyle accounted for the presence of his mother's Dodge truck in the 42 commuter lot. His claim was that he had met his mother in the commuter lot on the 4th of August.
He was having difficulties with his back pain, so he called his mother, and they met at the commuter lot where her truck was later found. And him and his mother went out on his route. He was driving the truck. His mother was throwing the garbage in the back of the garbage truck. After some period of time, he claimed that he called his father and he wanted to go home.
He alleged that he dropped his mother off to his father sometime around 10:30.
As Kyle continues talking, investigators make note of a discrepancy in his new statement.
In an initial statement, he told the police his parents had stopped by his house that day. Later on, in a different statement, he said his parents had not stopped by his house that day.
Now we know he's lying. Because if you're telling the truth is the truth. There may be little variances, but these were completely different recollection of the events.
Investigators release Kyle but continue collecting evidence against him. They start by obtaining a report from his cell phone company that reveals the whereabouts of his phone in the hours before his parents disappeared. Detectives compare the report with similar records for Jeffrey and Jeanette's phones.
We could tell with great precision where Jeanette's phone was and what the last real cell phone contact was. That was early in the morning on the day that she and Jeff disappeared.
The last tower that Jeanette's phone interacted with was the tower closest to Kyle's house in Bridgeport. Kyle's phone was also interacting with the tower closest to his house.
Jeffrey Naven's phone, the last activity on that phone hit off at the closest cell tower to Kyle Naven's house in Bridgeport. We see that Jeffrey Naven's phone is there and Kyle Naven's phone is there. We know they're together. It shows that Jeffrey and Kyle were in the same vicinity.
Police used the evidence to get a full subpoena for Jeffrey and Jeanette's phone records, and they reveal that Jeffrey had a heated text conversation with his son on the last morning he was seen alive.
Mid-morning of August 4th, Jeff Naven was in a heated phone conversation, screaming into his phone. At the Westport transfer station, evidence through both his cell phone records and Kyle's cell phone records indicate that that was a phone conversation with Kyle.
When investigators dig deeper into Jeffrey's messages, they uncover an alarming exchange between Jeffrey and Kyle on August 4th.
About 12:30, Jeff sent a message to Kyle, "Did you hurt Mom?" So clearly something had transpired between them, either in the oral conversation on the phone or in the text messages that we didn't have, that made Jeff think that Kyle had done something to Jeanette.
And then Jeffrey says, "You're setting me up."
Jeffrey would say, "I'm not coming home if you're trying to frame me for murder." Kyle again would say, "I don't know what you're talking about."
That didn't make sense on why the father would say that to his son, unless he had knowledge of something in the past that maybe his son said to him face to face.
At 1:14 p.m., Kyle Naven texted his father that he would be waiting for him at his house in Bridgeport.
And it went into, "All right, having a problem with my phone. I left you a spot on the street for you to park." I believe that was a little after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, was the last text from Dad.
When you read the text message, one of them says, "I'm going to call the police." And I think collectively, everybody who was part of this investigation wishes he didn't.
Coming up, police focus their efforts on a second person of interest.
I don't think he's being 100% truthful with us.
I'm being truthful, but it's hard for me to be accurate.
And a harrowing discovery sends shockwaves through the community.
When he went to scoop up a pile of leaves, he saw bones.
1 week after the disappearance of Jeffrey and Jeanette Naven, investigators have zeroed in on the couple's son, Kyle Naven, as their primary suspect. On August 12, 2015, Connecticut state troopers conduct a third interview with the 27-year-old.
There's a couple variations in your story that kind of, concern me in a way. I want to just clarify it all. Yeah.
Investigators focus on a series of text messages Kyle exchanged with his father on August 4th.
Kyle, you remember that question that your dad asked on the text?
What? Which question?
The one that...
Did you hurt Mom? Do you remember that?
No, I don't really remember.
It was our feeling that he was lying. So, let's get the latest set of lies out. It's being audio and video recorded. And then we can start picking apart this set of lies. Detective Allegro and I asked him point blank, "Did you kill your parents?"
Did you have anything to do with it? No. Did you hurt your parents?
No.
Did you kill your mother?
No.
Did you kill your father?
No. say they're no longer alive?
I think that person should be punished.
As their interview with Kyle intensifies, detectives notice a shift in his demeanor.
One of the things that was noteworthy was the body language. He was very just non-animated, monotone, one-word answers. Why was there such a lack of concern that my parents are missing? There was nothing, no emotion, which is unusual.
Unfortunately, without any evidence of foul play, police are unable to charge Kyle or keep him in custody.
Prior to Kyle leaving the Troop G barracks that evening, investigators advised him that we were seizing 2 items that he came to the troop with. We seized his cell phone, and we seized the vehicle that he drove himself to Troop G in the dump truck.
A forensic analysis of Kyle's phone reveals several deleted text messages between Kyle and his girlfriend, Jennifer Valiente, in the weeks before Jeffrey and Jeanette's disappearance.
On around July 8th of 2015, there's a text chain between Kyle and Jennifer in which Kyle is talking about the money his parents have in a credit union. He's talking about how he and Jennifer can get that money and then take luxury vacations, remodel their house, remodel the garbage truck, and have this idyllic, fantastic life together.
Kyle alludes to the fact that if his parents went away, which he put in quotes in the text message, that their lives would be so much better. Well, we all know what that is indicative of.
The new evidence prompts investigators to question Jennifer Valiente's knowledge of the disappearances.
The words she used seemed to be pushing Kyle to do something, to almost challenge him, I felt. She says to him, "You're getting played by his parents."
Investigators also conduct a forensic search of Kyle Naven's garbage truck.
They were able to locate what appeared to be 2 possible bullet holes through the passenger seat. That's a game changer. Once there was evidence of possible gunshots in the truck, they wanted to go back to Kyle's home in Bridgeport and do a more extensive search.
On August 18th, 11 days after the Navens were first reported missing, investigators execute a search warrant for Kyle Naven and Jennifer Valiente's Bridgeport home.
When we entered that home, we weren't sure what we were going to locate there, as far as could we find the thread of hope that someone's alive or find a body.
We located a Sig Sauer 40 caliber handgun and a Smith & Wesson 380 handgun, both of which were registered to Kyle. Another item that was located and seized was a Home Depot receipt.
The Home Depot receipt listed items that would be consistent with someone trying to cover up crime. Bleach, cleaners, contractor bags, blue painter's tape.
The receipt is dated Wednesday, August 5th, the day after Jeffrey and Jeanette Naven disappeared.
We basically went through the entire house, and we found some carpet missing in the basement.
It appeared to have been freshly cut out near the base of the stairwell. Various areas were sprayed with luminol, including the carpet area, and there was a positive reaction for human blood.
Investigators send the blood samples to the lab for DNA testing.
Detectives also noticed there appeared to be defects in the wall, which appeared consistent with striking of a concrete wall by projectiles. So as if someone coming down the stairs was fired upon from the basement.
Based on phone records, investigators speculate that Jeffrey Naven was headed to Kyle's house around 1 p.m. on August 4th.
But 1:23 p.m. on the 4th of August, 2015, Jeffrey Naven's cell phone makes its last contact with the network. It's on a tower which services Kyle Naven's house. We believe that Jeffrey entered the house and was lured into the basement and was killed in the basement.
But if Jeffrey Naven was murdered in Kyle's basement, who had returned his truck to Jeffrey and Jeanette's house in Easton? Investigators believe they know how to find out.
I was aware of a surveillance camera at a residence on one of our main roads in town, which happens to lead to the area of where Jeffrey and Jeanette Navin lived.
I went down, spoke with the gentleman who lived at the address, and he gave me consent to take the entire hard drive. And I was able to go back to the department, sift through minute by minute.
When investigators check the footage from August 4th, they spot Jeffrey Naven's truck pass at 3:06 p.m.
We saw the truck, and then we saw a small Honda behind it.
DMV records indicate that Jennifer Valiente owns a Honda identical to the vehicle following the garbage truck in the surveillance video.
And very quickly, we realized that that was the girlfriend following the truck. And then moments later, the Honda is driven back down Center Road towards Bridgeport without the truck. It appeared very common sense that Kyle drove the father's truck to the house in Easton, and then the girlfriend drove Kyle back to Bridgeport.
On August 21st, 2015, investigators bring Jennifer Valiente in for questioning and confront her with their findings.
One of the aspects that they addressed in this interview was surveillance footage from Center Road in Easton.
Now, the black Honda, that's your car, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You're the only one that drives it?
I drive it, yeah.
Okay.
And the reason that they had brought the vehicle up to leave it up at Jeffrey's house was supposedly that there had been a mechanical issue. Then the obvious follow-up question to that is, where's Jeffrey Naven during this time? She had no real response to that.
So that means Dad is at the Bridgeport house?
His father was on sale Sunday.
So the truck mysteriously appeared there?
I don't know how it got there. I don't know if Kyle brought it home. I don't know if I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
Investigators also asked Jennifer about the items she and Kyle purchased at Home Depot.
Do you remember, what would you need bleach for?
I don't know. I don't remember buying bleach.
Whenever she got to a difficult point in the conversation or a difficult question or was challenged, her response was always, I don't know, or I don't remember.
I don't think you've been 100% truthful with us, Sam.
I'm being truthful, but it's hard for me to be accurate. I'm trying to be accurate. It's not, like I said, if it happened yesterday or last week, I would know. Not even last week. But if it, you know what I mean? If it happened in the past few days.
Despite investigators' best efforts, Jennifer refuses to implicate herself or Kyle in Jeffrey and Jeanette's disappearance.
That time of limbo was very difficult. Law enforcement wanted to see the arrest, but we also understand from the prosecutor's standpoint, he doesn't want to make an arrest unless he feels he can bring it to a successful conclusion. And we had basically exhausted the investigation, where the only thing we needed was to find the bodies.
Nearly 3 months pass. Then, on October 29th, 2015, the case takes a grim turn when police receive a phone call about a discovery behind an unoccupied house.
The owner of the house went up there to move some leaves, some debris around, and when he went to scoop up a pile of leaves, he saw a tarp. And when he got out to look at it, he saw bones.
There discovery led them to step away and call the police. Weston police showed up. They noticed that right away that there was two bodies.
One body was found loosely wrapped in a tarp. The other is found tightly wrapped in contractor bags.
Autopsies confirm the remains belong to Jeanette and Jeffrey Naven.
The medical examiner's office was able to certify that both deaths were homicides and that the manner of death was gunshot wound.
In addition, a .40 caliber bullet was recovered from the remains.
Kyle Naven owned a .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The projectiles recovered from the bodies of his parents were the same caliber. That's enough for us to arrest Jennifer Valiente and Kyle Naven for the murder of his mother and the murder of his father in separate counts.
In Fairfield County, Connecticut, authorities have arrested Kyle Naven and Jennifer Valiente for the murders of Kyle's parents, Jeanette and Jeffrey Naven.
There were so many horrible truths that landed in one moment. The horrible truth that all the different things that people had hoped and speculated about where Jeff and Jeanette may have gone or what they might be doing, gone.
I think the whole community talked about it for months because we just could not believe it happened in our town.
Forensic analysts linked Jeanette Naven's DNA to blood samples found in Kyle Naven's truck. They also find traces of Jeanette's DNA on the .40 caliber gun retrieved from Kyle's house.
Jeanette Naven's blood was found on the muzzle of that pistol, which is a strong inference that that was indeed the murder weapon.
What we believe happened was sometime after 8:45, Kyle Naven was in the vehicle with his mother, shot her twice as she sat in his truck.
2 shots right in her chest.
She, in all likelihood, died in the truck next to her son as she was trying to help him work his job. He then drove up to the Staples Road address where his parents were renting their home in Easton.
Based on text recovered from Kyle's phone, police believe that after shooting his mother, he moved on to the next stage of his plan, luring his father back to his home.
He gets his father to meet him at his house on Aldine Street in Bridgeport, and when the father comes in the house, he somehow gets him into the basement.
DNA evidence recovered from the carpet confirms Kyle had been waiting in the basement for his father with deadly intent.
Careful examination of the wall going up the stairs from that basement found a small quantity of Jeff Naven's blood. The inference from this is that Kyle Naven was in the basement, Jeff Naven came down there, and he shot him.
After moving his father's truck, investigators theorize that Kyle's girlfriend, Jennifer Valiente, drove him home, where they cleaned up the scene and later disposed of the bodies.
When Kyle Naven disposed of the bodies of his murdered parents, they weren't in the ground, they weren't buried in a shallow grave. They were dumped in a pile of leaves. To him, it seemed that was sufficient. And he went back home to Bridgeport and got on with his life.
Our theory of the case was that Kyle had a deteriorating relationship with his parents over the summer of 2015. And in an effort to gain access to their money, he killed his parents.
I think that Kyle almost felt the victim. His parents were ruining his life by taking away his livelihood. He was thinking, just kill my parents and everything will be great.
With the evidence stacked against her, attorneys for Jennifer Valiente reach a plea deal with prosecutors in November of 2017.
Jennifer pled under the Alford Doctrine of conspiracy to commit murder, so she didn't admit she participated in the conspiracy, but conceded she could have been convicted. So she never admitted it.
Ultimately, Jennifer Valiente received a sentence of 15 years in the state's prison.
Kyle Navin fights the charges against him, filing repeated motions to suppress evidence. But on April 16, 2018, one day before his trial is set to begin, he agrees to plead guilty to 2 counts of murder.
The judge had a very impactful statement asking Kyle if he killed his parents, and he said yes.
He received 55 years on each count to run concurrent. In Connecticut, there is no parole for murder, and essentially you do day for day.
Kyle's guilty plea brings a measure of relief to many in the community, but it also leaves those who knew him before the crime in disbelief.
Kyle did horrible things for which he is rightly being held accountable. But there were no signs of that, which is what made this so much more upsetting at the time and confusing and hard.
When we prosecute people for crimes, we have to remember that they're human beings. Human beings are motivated by emotion, they're motivated by greed, they're motivated by love.
There was a conspiracy between those two to get rid of the parents so they could live happily ever after. We're going to get all this money, we're going to live happily ever after. Totally self-centered, 2 selfish individuals.
Part of the shock of this is in the compassionate character of the family. The Navens were the type of people, they would do anything for other people, for people that so consistently demonstrated such depth of goodness. To have this happen to them all these years later, this still does not seem real. It's completely surreal.
On the morning of June 2nd, 2010, Cumbria looked exactly the way it always had. Quiet, green, predictable. In the far northwest of England, the county stretched across rolling hills, stone villages, narrow roads, and cold coastal air drifting in from the Irish Sea. Farmers were already awake before sunrise. Delivery vans moved slowly through the countryside. Shop owners prepared to unlock their doors. Taxi drivers started their morning shifts beneath gray skies that threatened rain, but never fully committed to it. Nothing about that morning suggested that, within a few hours, Cumbria would become the center of one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern British history. In places like Whitehaven, Egremont, and Seascale, people knew one another by face if not by name. The roads were familiar. The routines rarely changed. Children walked to school along streets their parents had walked decades earlier. Elderly residents sat in cafes where the staff already knew their orders before they spoke. Violent crime was uncommon here. Mass shootings felt even more distant, like tragedies that happened somewhere else. In another country, in another culture. Britain's strict gun laws had created a sense, whether entirely accurate or not, that this kind of horror simply did not belong in everyday British life. But at some point shortly after 5 o'clock that morning, a dark taxi began moving through Cumbria carrying a man named Derek Bird. 52 years old, a local taxi driver, quiet, divorced, known but not deeply known. The kind of man people described with vague sentences. Kept to himself, didn't say much, seemed normal enough. Those phrases appear again and again after tragedies like this, as if communities search desperately for meaning in ordinary memories. At first, Nothing about the vehicle itself stood out. A taxi driving through rural roads at dawn was not unusual. Not in Cumbria, not in Whitehaven. But inside that vehicle were two firearms, a shotgun and a rifle fitted with a scope, and a man whose state of mind investigators would later describe as deeply unstable and deteriorating. What followed over the next several hours would leave 12 people dead, 11 more injured. An entire communities traumatized by violence that seemed to erupt without warning from the middle of ordinary life. The first reports that reached emergency operators were confusing. A shooting, then another. Different locations, different victims. At first, there was uncertainty about whether these incidents were connected at all. In the early stages of unfolding disasters, confusion often becomes its own kind of terror. Information arrives in fragments. Witnesses panic. Dispatchers attempt to separate rumor from fact. Police race toward scenes without understanding the scale of what they are entering. In Cumbria, that confusion grew rapidly because the violence was moving. This was not a single contained crime scene. The gunfire appeared across multiple towns and roads separated by miles of countryside. Calls flooded emergency lines from frightened residents who had seen a taxi slowed down beside pedestrians before shots rang out. Some witnesses reported that the gunman appeared completely calm. That detail would become one of the most haunting elements of the case. One witness later remembered, "He looked calm. He wasn't shouting. He was just driving and shooting." There is something profoundly disturbing about controlled violence. People expect rage to look chaotic. They expect screaming, panic frenzy. But multiple witnesses described Derek Bird as composed, quiet, focused, a man carrying out actions that seemed impossible to reconcile with the stillness in his expression. As the morning continued, fear spread faster than official information could keep up with it. In small towns, rumors travel quickly. People began calling family members. Shopkeepers locked doors. Parents tried reaching children and relatives. Drivers abandoned roads after hearing reports of gunfire nearby. Police officers scrambled to determine where the shooter might appear next. Because Cumbria is geographically vast and heavily rural in places, coordinating an armed response became extraordinarily difficult. The gunman was mobile, unpredictable, and familiar with the local roads. Every passing minute widened the radius of fear. To understand why this case shook Britain so deeply, it is important to understand how unusual such events were, and still are, within the United Kingdom. The nation had experienced mass shootings before, most notably the Hungerford Massacre in 1987 and the Dunblane School Massacre in 1996. Those tragedies had permanently shaped British debates around firearms. After Dunblane especially, handgun laws became dramatically stricter. For many people across Britain, there existed a belief that large-scale gun violence had become something distant from British daily life. Yet on that June morning in 2010, news channels began interrupting normal programming with reports from Cumbria. A taxi driver, multiple shootings, casualties across several towns, armed police deployed, helicopters searching rural roads. The story expanded by the hour, each update darker than the last. Meanwhile, in the communities themselves, residents were attempting to understand something that defied logic. Cumbria was not London. It was not a densely populated urban center where anonymity dominated daily life. These were tightly connected towns where people recognized local taxi drivers, waved to neighbors, and expected familiarity from the faces around them. That familiarity became part of the horror. Some victims reportedly knew Derek Bird personally. Others were complete strangers chosen seemingly at random. The violence crossed boundaries between personal grievance and indiscriminate attack, making it difficult for investigators, and later the public, to fully explain where intention ended and chaos began. Throughout the morning, Derek Bird drove through Whitehaven, Egremont, and Seascale. among other areas, carrying out shootings that appeared almost methodical in their movement. Witnesses described moments so sudden they barely seemed real. A vehicle slowing near the roadside, a window lowering, a gunshot cracking through the quiet air. Then the taxi moving on again before people fully understood what had happened. Some victims were shot while standing outdoors, others while traveling through the area. The randomness amplified the terror because there was no clear pattern visible to the public in real time. No one knew who might be next. The police response escalated rapidly as authorities realized they were dealing with an active, mobile shooter moving across an enormous geographic area. Armed officers were deployed. Roads were monitored and blocked where possible. Residents were warned to stay indoors. Helicopters scanned the countryside from above. But despite the growing response, there remained an uncomfortable truth at the center of the crisis. Much of Cumbria was open land connected by winding roads that allowed movement in countless directions. Bird understood the terrain. The police were trying to catch up to violence already in motion. Across Britain, television viewers watched maps of Cumbria appear on screen while reporters attempted to explain where shootings had occurred. For many outside the county, these towns had been almost invisible before that day. Suddenly, their names became associated with national tragedy. Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale. Places that had once represented quiet coastal life were now connected by emergency sirens, police tape, and disbelief. Yet amid the national attention, the experience inside the communities themselves was intensely personal. Behind every headline existed interrupted routines and ordinary people caught in extraordinary horror. A retired resident beginning a normal morning. A man driving through familiar roads. A pedestrian walking through town. Lives divided forever into before and after. One of the most chilling aspects of the Cumbria shootings was not only the scale of the violence, but the atmosphere surrounding it. Witnesses repeatedly described an eerie calmness. There were no speeches, no manifesto, no public declaration of motive, just movement, road after road, town after town. A taxi crossing the countryside while fear spread behind it. And somewhere during those terrible hours, another realization began settling over Cumbria. The man responsible was not a stranger passing through. He belonged to the community itself. Derek Bird was local. People recognized him. Some had ridden in his taxi. Others had seen him in cafes, on roads, outside shops. That familiarity transformed the tragedy into something even more psychologically devastating. Violence is frightening enough when it arrives from outside. It becomes far harder to process when it emerges from someone who had always appeared ordinary. As the morning advanced toward midday, the manhunt intensified. Police tracked reports across rural roads and villages while helicopters searched wooded areas. Armed response teams moved through the county, attempting to predict Bird's direction. Eventually, after hours of chaos, the search led toward a wooded area near Boot. There, the violence that had consumed Cumbria finally came to an end. Derek Bird was found dead from a self-inflicted shotgun wound. The silence afterward must have felt surreal. For hours, Cumbria had existed inside constant movement, sirens, radio calls, helicopters overhead, frightened voices on telephones. Then suddenly it stopped. But endings in cases like this are never clean. The gunfire may end in a single day, yet the consequences continue for years. Families begin receiving confirmation that loved ones are gone. Survivors replay seconds they cannot forget. Witnesses question what they saw. Entire communities struggle to reconcile memory with reality. And investigators begin the difficult process of reconstructing not only what happened, but why. Because long after the roads reopened and the helicopters disappeared from the sky, one question remained hanging over Cumbria and over Britain itself. How did an isolated taxi driver from a quiet English town become the man responsible for one of the country's deadliest modern mass shootings. Before June 2, 2010, Cumbria was not a place most people in Britain associated with violence. The county sat in the far northwest of England, a region defined more by mountains, coastlines, sheep farms, and quiet villages than by crime headlines. Tourists came for the Lake District, for the narrow country roads that twisted through green hills, for the feeling that life there moved more slowly than in the crowded cities farther south. Many of the communities scattered across Cumbria were tightly connected in ways that larger urban areas no longer were. People recognized one another in supermarkets. Taxi drivers knew their regular passengers. Shop owners remembered names, faces, routines. In places like Whitehaven and Egremont, familiarity was part of daily life. There was comfort in that predictability. But sometimes familiarity creates its own blind spots. Sometimes a person can quietly unravel in plain sight while everyone around them continues believing they understand who he is. Derek Bird had lived much of his life inside that ordinary landscape. Born in 1957, he spent years working as a taxi driver in Whitehaven, a coastal town with rows of terraced houses, small businesses, and roads overlooking the gray waters of the Irish Sea. On the surface, his life appeared unremarkable. He was not wealthy. He was not politically extreme. He was not known as a public troublemaker. In many ways, he blended into the background of local life. That normality would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. When communities attempt to process mass violence, they often search for signs that should have been obvious. People want clear warnings, unmistakable signals, dramatic indicators that horror was approaching. But with Derek Bird, the picture described by many who knew him was quieter and more ambiguous. Neighbors and acquaintances often characterized him as withdrawn, reserved, the kind of man who spoke little and kept to himself. He had worked for years as a taxi driver, spending long hours alone behind the wheel, moving through the roads and towns of Cumbria, carrying strangers from one place to another. Taxi work can create a strange kind of existence. Drivers occupy an in-between space in people's lives. They hear fragments of conversations, witness celebrations, arguments, drunken confessions, exhausted silences. Yet they themselves often remain emotionally distant from the passengers they transport. For someone already inclined toward isolation, that lifestyle can deepen solitude rather than relieve it. By 2010, Derek Bird's personal life appeared increasingly strained. He was divorced and living alone. Investigators later concluded that he had become deeply suspicious of people around him, particularly concerning money and family disputes. Among the most significant tensions was his deteriorating relationship with his twin brother, David Bird. The exact emotional history between the brothers remained private in many respects. But investigators believe Derek had become convinced that David intended to take money or property that rightfully belonged to him. That belief appears to have grown into paranoia. And paranoia has a dangerous quality when left unchecked. It reshapes ordinary events into evidence. A betrayal. Financial pressure also weighed heavily on Bird's mind. Authorities later determined that he was under stress connected to tax issues. Even without dramatic external crises, prolonged financial anxiety can erode a person's sense of stability. Bills investigations, disputes over money. These things often grow silently in the background of daily life until they begin influencing every thought. According to people who knew him, Bird increasingly seemed consumed by suspicion and resentment. There were also reports of tensions with other taxi drivers in the area. Again, no single dispute appeared large enough on its own to predict mass violence. That is one of the uncomfortable realities investigators encountered afterward. There was no single moment that explained everything. No manifesto, no final public declaration. Instead, police believed several pressures had converged over time. social isolation, psychological decline, financial fear, interpersonal conflict, and growing paranoia. Together, those pressures appear to have created a mindset increasingly detached from rational perspective. Yet even that explanation has limits. Thousands of people experience loneliness, divorce, debt, or family conflict without becoming violent. The challenge in understanding cases like Cumbria is acknowledging deterioration without simplifying it into inevitability. Derek Bird was not merely driven by circumstance. At some point, he made choices. Deliberate, catastrophic choices that would destroy lives across an entire county. But before those choices unfolded publicly, there existed another reality running parallel to his private collapse. The ordinary lives of the people who would become victims. One of the most heartbreaking elements of the Cumbria shootings is how deeply ordinary the victims were. These were not people connected by politics or ideology. They were not gathered in one place for a single event. Many had never met one another. Some knew Derek Bird personally. Others were complete strangers who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment on an ordinary Wednesday morning. Among the dead was David Bird, Derek's own twin brother. The killing introduced a deeply personal dimension to the violence from the very beginning. Family-related grievances appear to have been central to Derek Bird's thinking during the hours leading up to the shootings. Investigators believe David may have been the first victim, though the precise emotional reasoning inside Derek's mind can never be fully reconstructed. What is clear is that the violence began within his own family before expanding outward into the wider community. Another victim was Kevin Commons, the family solicitor. His death reinforced investigators' belief that at least part of the attack was connected to perceived grievances and suspicions surrounding finances or personal conflict. But after those targeted killings, the violence spread beyond any coherent personal motive. Bird began shooting pedestrians, motorists, cyclists, colleagues, and strangers. The line between targeted resentment and random murder dissolved. That randomness became the defining terror of the case. Many victims were simply living out routines, so ordinary they barely seemed worth remembering until tragedy interrupted them forever. Some were driving through familiar roads. Some were walking outdoors during the morning hours. Some were older residents spending another quiet day in towns they had lived in for decades. One of the cruelest aspects of sudden violence is how it transforms ordinary moments into final moments without warning. A person leaves home believing the day ahead will resemble every other day that came before it. They make small plans. Think about errands. Consider work, lunch, appointments, phone calls. Then history crashes violently into routine. And afterward, families reconstruct those final hours with painful precision. What time did they leave home? What were they wearing? Who spoke to them last? In Cumbria, many survivors and witnesses would later describe confusion before fear. Because the shootings unfolded across multiple towns, people initially struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. A loud bang in the distance, a vehicle slowing nearby, a man raising a weapon through a car window. Human beings naturally search for explanations that fit within normal life. Fireworks, an accident, construction noise, anything except the truth. By the time fear fully arrived, it was often already too late. There's also something uniquely traumatic about violence committed by someone recognizable. Derek Bird was not an unknown drifter entering the county from elsewhere. He belonged to the same communities now terrified of him. Some people who heard his name on police broadcasts likely knew him personally. They may have ridden in his taxi weeks earlier or exchanged casual greetings in town. That familiarity fractures a community's sense of safety in profound ways. It forces people to reconsider past interactions through the lens of future horror. Were there signs? Did anyone notice changes? Could something have been prevented? These questions often linger long after official investigations end because they reflect a deeper, Fear that catastrophic violence can emerge quietly from ordinary lives without clear warning. In the aftermath, many descriptions of Derek Bird carried a common theme: isolation. He was often alone, emotionally distant, increasingly disconnected from people around him. Isolation itself does not create killers, but prolonged isolation can distort perception, especially when combined with paranoia and unresolved psychological decline. Without meaningful emotional support or intervention, resentment can deepen unchecked. Suspicion hardens. Minor grievances grow into obsessions. The individual becomes trapped inside his own interpretation of reality. Still, it is important to resist turning Derek Bird into the tragic center of the story. The emotional core of the Cumbria shootings belongs not to the gunman, but to the people whose lives ended or changed forever because of his actions. 12 people were killed. 11 others were injured. Behind those numbers existed families, friendships, routines, histories, and futures that vanished in a matter of hours. And because the attacks occurred across different towns and roads, the grief spread geographically as well as emotionally. Entire communities carried pieces of the trauma. In small towns, death travels differently than it does in large cities. News arrives personally, sometimes through phone calls, sometimes through silence, sometimes through seeing police vehicles parked outside a familiar home. Communities like Whitehaven and Egremont are built on interconnected lives. When violence strikes one person, it echoes outward through neighbors, coworkers, relatives, schools, cafes, and workplaces. The emotional damage becomes communal rather than isolated. In the days after the shootings, Cumbria would struggle to absorb what had happened. But before investigators reconstructed timelines and before national debates about firearms and mental health began, there existed a simpler and more painful reality. On the morning of June 2nd, ordinary people across Cumbria began their day believing they were safe inside familiar routines. Somewhere else in that same landscape, Derek Bird was already carrying weapons inside his taxi, driving toward a future that would permanently scar the county he had spent most of his life moving through almost invisibly. Shortly after dawn on June 2nd, 2010, Derek Bird began driving through Cumbria with 2 firearms inside his taxi, a shotgun and a scoped rifle. The roads were still relatively quiet at that hour. Early commuters moved through familiar routes. Shopkeepers prepared for another normal business day. Across Whitehaven and the surrounding towns, there was no indication that a mass shooting had already begun unfolding. Investigators would later believe that the first victim was Derek Bird's twin brother, David Bird. The killing immediately established that at least part of the violence was rooted in deeply personal grievances. For years, tensions had reportedly existed between Derek and members of his family, particularly surrounding money and inheritance-related suspicions. Authorities later concluded that Derek had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that people close to him were attempting to deprive him of what he believed belonged to him. But whatever specific thoughts moved through his mind that morning died with him. What remained were the consequences. After killing his brother, Derek Bird continued moving through Cumbria. Another early victim was Kevin Commons, the family solicitor. That second killing reinforced investigators' belief that Bird's anger was tied, at least initially, to personal disputes and financial anxieties. Yet the horrifying reality of the Cumbria shootings is that the violence did not remain targeted for long. Something shifted as the morning progressed. The attack expanded beyond specific grievances into something broader, colder, and more indiscriminate. Derek Bird got back into his taxi and continued driving. The county itself became the crime scene. Whitehaven was beginning to wake fully by then. Cars appeared more frequently along the roads. People moved between shops, homes, and workplaces. Some pedestrians walked through town centers carrying coffee or newspapers. Others drove toward work without any awareness of the danger already moving through nearby streets. Witnesses later described seeing Bird's taxi approach calmly, almost casually. There was no dramatic chase in those early moments. No obvious panic from the gunman himself. According to several accounts, he simply slowed the vehicle, lowered a window, and opened fire. The simplicity of the violence made it even more difficult for witnesses to process. Human beings expect warning before catastrophe. Raised voices, chaotic behavior, threats. But Bird's actions often arrived in silence and disappeared just as quickly. Some people reportedly did not even understand what they had witnessed until after the vehicle had already driven away. In several cases, victims were attacked without any interaction at all. They happened to be nearby. That was enough. As Bird moved through Whitehaven and toward other towns, including Egremont and Seascale, emergency calls began flooding local dispatch centers. At first, police struggled to understand what they were dealing with. Reports came from different locations almost simultaneously. Gunshots, injured civilians, a taxi driver, multiple victims. The geographic spread of the attacks created immediate confusion because British police forces rarely encounter mobile mass shootings of this scale. Officers responding to one incident quickly learned another shooting had occurred miles away. Then another. Dispatchers attempted to connect fragmented witness accounts into a coherent picture while armed. Units mobilized across a largely rural county connected by winding roads. The uncertainty itself became terrifying. Residents across Cumbria began hearing rumors before receiving official information. Some learned about shootings through phone calls from relatives. Others through neighbors rushing indoors. Shopkeepers locked doors. Drivers turned around on country roads after hearing police sirens or seeing emergency vehicles speeding past. Parents attempted to contact children and family members. In communities where violence was rare, the psychological shock spread rapidly because nobody knew where danger would appear next. Meanwhile, Derek Bird continued driving. That movement was one of the defining characteristics of the case. This was not a single attack contained within one building or one street. It unfolded across an entire region. The roads of Cumbria became pathways of uncertainty. Every sighting triggered new fear. Every report forced police to redirect resources. Witnesses later recalled how surreal the experience felt. One moment the morning seemed ordinary. The next, armed officers were appearing in towns where such scenes almost never occurred. In Egremont, panic escalated dramatically after Bird opened fire in broad daylight. People ran into shops and buildings searching for cover. Others dropped to the ground or fled through side streets without fully understanding where the shots were coming from. Several witnesses later described the atmosphere as strangely unreal, as though daily life had suddenly fractured apart. And throughout all of it, the image that remained with many survivors was Bird's apparent calmness. One witness later described him in chillingly simple terms. He looked calm. He wasn't shouting. He was just driving and shooting. That detail haunted many people afterward because it contradicted how society imagines violence. There was no visible frenzy, no dramatic declarations, just a man driving through familiar roads with deliberate purpose. Some reports suggested that in certain moments Bird even called out victims by name before firing, though many others were complete strangers chosen at random from roadsides, sidewalks, or passing vehicles. The attack moved unpredictably between targeted grievance and indiscriminate murder. That unpredictability made survival feel arbitrary. Throughout the morning, Cumbria police faced enormous logistical difficulties. Rural geography complicated every aspect of the response. Towns and villages were separated by miles of open roads and countryside. Armed response units had to coordinate across a large region while information changed constantly. Helicopters were deployed overhead to search for Bird's vehicle. Roads were monitored and closed where possible. Residents were warned to stay indoors. But every minute mattered, and Bird kept moving. The randomness of the attacks created another layer of fear. Many victims had no known connection to Derek Bird whatsoever. Some were simply driving through the area. Others were standing outside or walking along roads. The normal activities of daily life suddenly carried lethal risk. In many mass casualty events, survivors later speak about the collapse of routine, the moment ordinary assumptions about safety disappear permanently. Cumbria experienced that collapse in real time. Roads that had always represented familiarity and routine became associated with uncertainty and death. As reports spread nationally, television networks interrupted programming with breaking news updates. Across Britain, viewers struggled to understand how such violence could unfold in modern England, particularly in a rural county better known for tourism and quiet landscapes than armed attacks. Comparisons to earlier British mass shootings began appearing almost immediately. But for those inside Cumbria, broader national discussion meant little in those hours. Their focus remained immediate and personal. Who had been hurt? Which roads were safe? Where was the gunman now? Could there be more than one shooter? Fear filled the gaps left by incomplete information. At several points during the spree, police reportedly came close to tracking Bird's location, only for new reports to emerge elsewhere. The movement of the taxi transformed the county into a constantly shifting emergency zone. Every passing, dark-colored vehicle risked triggering alarm. Helicopters circled overhead while officers attempted to piece together Bird's route in real time. The challenge facing authorities was not only stopping the gunman, but understanding his direction before more people died. Yet despite the rapidly expanding police response, the killings continued. By late morning, Cumbria had already suffered devastating losses. 12 people would ultimately be killed. 11 others would survive injuries. Behind those numbers existed scenes of chaos and grief unfolding simultaneously across different communities. Ambulances moved between towns carrying victims. Witnesses gave shaken statements to police. Families tried desperately to reach loved ones whose phones no longer answered. Hospitals prepared for incoming casualties while uncertainty still hung over the county. One of the most psychologically devastating elements of the Cumbria shootings was how ordinary the settings remained even during the violence. These were not battlefields or high-security government sites. They were roads, sidewalks, small town centers, and rural routes people traveled every day. The contrast between setting and violence intensified the shock. Cumbria's peaceful landscape became inseparable from the horror unfolding across it. Eventually, after hours of shootings, Derek Bird drove toward the remote area near Boot in the Eskdale Valley. By then, armed police and helicopters were searching aggressively across the county. Authorities warned residents to remain indoors while officers attempted to narrow Bird's possible location. The manhunt had transformed into one of the largest armed police responses many local residents had ever witnessed. Then, sometime around midday, the violence abruptly ended. Police discovered Derek Bird's body in a wooded area near Boot. He had died from self-inflicted shotgun wound. The shooting spree was over. But endings in events like this are deceptive. The gunfire stops long before the damage does. Across Cumbria, people were still learning who had survived and who had not. Emergency responders remained at multiple scenes. Roads stayed closed. Investigators began securing evidence spread across a huge geographic area, and families entered the first terrible hours of grief and disbelief. For survivors and witnesses, the images of that morning would not disappear simply because the gunman was dead. Many had seen violence erupt suddenly out of ordinary life. Some had watched strangers collapse beside roads. Others had hidden inside shops or homes while waiting for news. The psychological impact spread far beyond the immediate victims because entire communities had experienced the same collective terror at once. In the aftermath, one question surfaced repeatedly. Why? Why would a quiet taxi driver from Whitehaven carry out such catastrophic violence? Investigators would spend months reconstructing Bird's movements, relationships, financial concerns, and mental state in an attempt to answer that question. But on the day itself, Cumbria was left with something far more immediate than explanation. Silence after chaos. Roads emptied by fear. Helicopters fading from the sky. And a county struggling to understand how an ordinary Wednesday morning had transformed into one of the darkest days in modern British criminal history. By the afternoon of June 2, 2010, the gunfire had stopped, but Cumbria was still trapped inside confusion. Across multiple towns and rural roads, police officers stood guard over scattered crime scenes, while emergency crews moved between locations collecting evidence and transporting victims. Helicopters no longer searched the skies for Derek Bird. Yet the atmosphere across the county remained tense and surreal. Residents stayed indoors long after authorities confirmed the gunman was dead. Many people still did not fully understand what had happened. Others knew fragments only through rumor. In Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale, and the surrounding areas, families waited for confirmation about loved ones. Some hospitals restricted information while officers attempted to notify relatives personally. In small communities, tragedy spreads quickly, but certainty arrives slowly. During those first hours, Cumbria police faced an enormous task. This had not been a single homicide scene contained within one building. The shootings stretched across a broad geographic region connected by roads, villages, and isolated rural areas. Investigators needed to reconstruct the movement of a mobile killer who had carried out attacks over several hours while driving through the county in his taxi. The first challenge was establishing a reliable timeline. Emergency calls had flooded dispatch centers from different locations in rapid succession. Witness statements overlapped, contradicted one another, or arrived incomplete because many people had been too frightened to fully process what they had seen. Some callers only knew they had heard gunshots. Others reported seeing injured civilians near roadsides. A few had directly witnessed Derek Bird lowering the window of his vehicle before firing. Detectives began gathering every available fragment: phone records, witness accounts, road sightings. Police dispatch logs and forensic evidence from multiple scenes spread across Cumbria. Piece by piece, investigators mapped Bird's route through Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale, and other areas affected by the shootings. Reconstructing that movement became essential not only for understanding how events unfolded, but also for identifying possible motives and patterns behind specific attacks. One of the first conclusions investigators reached was that the violence appeared to begin with personal grievances before evolving into indiscriminate murder. The deaths of David Bird, Derek's twin brother, and family solicitor Kevin Commons strongly suggested that at least part of the rampage was rooted in long-standing resentment and paranoia connected to money and family conflict. Authorities later concluded that Derek Bird had become increasingly convinced people around him were trying to take what belonged to him, particularly regarding financial matters. Investigators explored reports of disputes involving inheritance concerns, tax-related stress, and tensions with people close to him. Yet, even as detectives uncovered evidence of personal grievances, another reality complicated the investigation. Many victims had absolutely no connection to Derek Bird at all. Random motorists, pedestrians, cyclists, retirees, ordinary civilians simply moving through Cumbria that morning. This shift from targeted killings to random shootings made the case psychologically difficult to categorize. Some mass attacks follow a clear ideological or personal logic, however horrifying. But in Cumbria, investigators encountered a trajectory that seemed to unravel as it progressed. Personal anger expanded outward into generalized violence. The question became not only why Derek Bird killed specific people, but why he continued killing strangers afterward. To answer that question, investigators began examining Derek Bird's personal life in greater depth. Friends, neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances were interviewed extensively. The image that emerged was of a man who had become increasingly isolated over time. Witnesses described him as quiet, withdrawn, and emotionally distant. Several people reported concerns about growing paranoia in the months leading up to the shootings. Bird reportedly believed others were conspiring against him financially. Tax issues appeared to weigh heavily on his mind, and investigators concluded he had become deeply anxious about money and perceived betrayal. There were also reports of tension with fellow taxi drivers. Again, none of these individual factors alone could explain mass murder. That reality frustrated both investigators and the public. Modern society often searches for singular causes after tragedies, hoping a clear explanation will restore a sense of order. But the Cumbria shootings resisted simple conclusions. Detectives increasingly believed the attack resulted from a convergence of pressures rather than one. Isolated trigger, social isolation, psychological decline, financial fear, family conflict, long-term resentment. Together, these elements may have created a mindset increasingly detached from rational perspective. Yet, even after months of investigation, authorities acknowledged that some aspects of Derek Bird's motivations remained impossible to fully understand. Unlike many perpetrators of large-scale violence, Bird left behind no manifesto or public explanation. There were no political statements, no recorded messages attempting to justify his actions, no coherent narrative explaining why he chose to expand personal grievances into indiscriminate killing. That absence created a void investigators could only partially fill through evidence and inference. Another major focus of the investigation involved Bird's firearms. Britain has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, particularly after previous tragedies such as the Hungerford Massacre in 1987 and the Dunblane School Massacre in 1996. Yet Derek Bird legally possessed the weapons used during the shootings. This fact immediately triggered national debate. Investigators examined the licensing process, Bird's firearm history, and whether warning signs about his mental state had been missed. Authorities reviewed how legally owned guns could still become instruments of mass violence despite strict regulations. The issue was especially sensitive because many Britons believed such laws had significantly reduced the likelihood of shootings on this scale. The Cumbria case challenged assumptions about safety and prevention. As forensic teams processed evidence across multiple crime scenes, investigators also faced the emotional burden carried by witnesses and survivors. Many people interviewed by police were deeply traumatized. Some had seen victims collapse beside roads. Others had hidden in buildings while fearing the gunman might return at any moment. Several witnesses struggled to describe the surreal calmness Bird reportedly displayed during the attacks. Again and again, investigators heard variations of the same unsettling observation. He did not appear frantic. He appeared controlled. That detail became psychologically significant because it contradicted expectations of chaotic rage. The image of a quiet taxi driver calmly moving through familiar roads while committing murder haunted both witnesses and investigators alike. The geographic spread of the shootings also complicated forensic work. Each scene required careful documentation, ballistic analysis, witness canvassing, and coordination with surrounding jurisdictions. Roads had to remain closed while evidence was collected. Officers worked to establish precise sequences of movement and timing. Even small discrepancies mattered because understanding Bird's route could clarify whether certain Attacks were random opportunities or deliberate choices. Meanwhile, media attention intensified across Britain. News coverage dominated national broadcasts for days. Newspapers published maps tracing birds' movements through Cumbria, while journalists attempted to profile both the victims and the gunmen. Comparisons to Hungerford and Dunblane appeared constantly. For many Britons, the Cumbria shootings represented a disturbing reminder that even strict firearm laws could not eliminate the possibility of mass violence entirely. Yet investigators remained cautious about simplistic comparisons. Unlike school shootings or ideologically driven attacks, Derek Bird's rampage appeared deeply personal, fragmented, and psychologically unstable. There was no broader movement or organized motive behind it. It emerged from the collapse of one individual's mental and emotional state. That distinction mattered because it shaped how authorities approached prevention discussions. Afterward, mental health became another central topic of investigation and public debate. Detectives reviewing Bird's life found increasing evidence of deterioration, paranoia, and social withdrawal. However, there is also recognition that many individuals experience mental health struggles without becoming violent. Authorities avoided making broad claims that mental illness alone explained the shootings. Instead, the investigation pointed toward a combination of untreated psychological decline alongside specific personal grievances and access to firearms. The complexity of those interacting factors made prevention questions especially difficult. Could someone have intervened? Were there missed warning signs? Or had Derek Bird concealed the extent of his instability until it erupted into irreversible violence? In communities across Cumbria, these questions became deeply personal. Because Bird was local, many residents replayed previous encounters with him, searching for meaning. People remembered conversations differently after learning what he had done. Ordinary interactions suddenly felt ominous in hindsight. This is a common psychological response after mass violence. Communities reconstruct memory in an attempt to restore logic to events that feel senseless. But hindsight rarely produces certainty. Most people who knew Derek Bird had not viewed him as someone capable of mass murder. Troubled perhaps, withdrawn perhaps, but not this. The investigation also revealed the enormous challenge police faced during the attack itself. Cumbria's rural geography had severely complicated response efforts. Armed units needed time to move between distant locations connected by narrow roads. Information changed constantly as new emergency calls arrived. The concept of a mobile shooter became central to post-incident analysis because Bird's ability to keep moving prevented authorities from containing the threat quickly. In later years, British policing agencies would study the Cumbria response carefully to improve strategies for handling similar incidents involving fast-moving armed suspects across wide geographic areas. As investigators gradually completed their reconstruction of events, a broader emotional reality settled over Cumbria. The county was no longer simply processing a crime scene. It was processing collective trauma. Memorials appeared. Flowers accumulated outside churches and public spaces. Communities gathered in mourning. Survivors attempted to resume routines that no longer felt normal. Some witnesses reported ongoing anxiety whenever they saw taxis resembling Bird's vehicle. Others struggled with guilt for surviving random encounters that had killed people standing only feet away. The randomness of the violence left psychological scars precisely because there had been no clear logic determining who lived and who died. Throughout the investigation, one fact remained painfully clear. Many of the victims had simply crossed paths with Derek Bird during the wrong moments on an ordinary morning. There was no ideology to debate, no political cause to dissect, no broader conspiracy to expose. Instead, investigators confronted something more unsettling: a lonely and deteriorating man whose private resentments and psychological collapse exploded outward across an entire county, leaving behind devastation that no investigation, however thorough, could ever fully explain away. In most major criminal cases, there's a trial. A courtroom becomes the place where evidence is organized into narrative, where prosecutors present motive, where defense attorneys challenge assumptions, and where survivors and families wait for a verdict that, while never capable of repairing loss, at least provides a formal ending to the public process. But the Cumbria shootings would never reach that stage. Derek Bird's suicide in the wooded area near Butte ended the possibility of criminal prosecution. Before it could begin, there would be no cross-examination, no sentencing, no direct answers from the man responsible for 12 deaths and 11 injuries. Instead, the responsibility for understanding the case shifted almost entirely onto investigators, forensic teams, and later the coroner's inquiry. That absence shaped the aftermath profoundly. When perpetrators survive, society often expects a courtroom explanation. In Cumbria, there would only be reconstruction. Investigators had to piece together motive and chronology from physical evidence, witness testimony, personal records, and fragments of Derek Bird's life left behind after his death. The official inquiry became less about determining guilt, which was already undeniable, and more about understanding how the shootings unfolded, why they may have happened, and whether anything could have prevented them. For the families of victims, that distinction mattered. A criminal trial, however painful, allows confrontation with evidence in a structured setting. It creates a public record through testimony and argument. Without that process, grief often remains tangled with uncertainty. Questions linger differently when the only person capable of fully explaining his actions is already dead. As the formal investigation moved forward, authorities worked to establish definitive conclusions regarding the sequence of events and Bird's state of mind. The evidence strongly suggested that the shootings began with deeply personal grievances before, expanding into random violence across Cumbria. Investigators concluded that Bird had likely become consumed by paranoia surrounding finances, inheritance concerns, and perceived betrayal by people close to him. His relationship with his twin brother David appeared particularly strained. Tax-related anxieties also emerged as a significant source of pressure. Combined with social isolation and emotional deterioration, authorities believe these factors contributed to a profound psychological collapse. Yet even within those conclusions, officials remained careful not to oversimplify the case. There was no single trigger that fully explained the transformation from private resentment into mass murder. Investigators repeatedly emphasized that multiple pressures appeared to converge simultaneously: loneliness, suspicion, financial fear, interpersonal conflict, emotional instability. Together, they formed a dangerous combination that seems to have intensified over time. Still, the inquiry also acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Not every question could be answered with certainty. Derek Bird had left no manifesto, no recorded confession, no coherent explanation for why he chose to continue shooting strangers after targeting individuals connected to his personal grievances. That uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The official findings established probable motives, but they could never completely reconstruct the internal logic of a deteriorating mind. In the absence of a trial, public attention shifted heavily toward the victims and survivors. Across Cumbria, memorial services began taking place in churches, community centers, and public gathering spaces. Flowers covered sidewalks and railings. Messages appeared honoring those who had lost their lives during the shootings. The names of towns like Whitehaven, Egremont, and Seascale became associated not only with tragedy, but with mourning. In small communities, grief rarely remains private for long. People attend the same schools, work in the same businesses, shop in the same stores. A single death can ripple outward through hundreds of lives. 12 deaths spread those ripples across an entire county. For survivors, the aftermath introduced a different kind of struggle. Physical injuries healed at different rates, but psychological wounds often lingered far longer. Some witnesses reportedly struggled with anxiety after the shootings. Others found ordinary routines transformed by fear. Driving familiar roads no longer felt entirely safe. Seeing taxis similar to Bird's vehicle triggered panic for some residents. Survivors of mass violence frequently describe how random moments become permanently altered by trauma. Sounds, locations. Ordinary objects, things once meaningless acquire emotional weight after catastrophe. Cumbria experienced that transformation collectively. The roads themselves became part of memory. Nationally, the shootings prompted widespread reflection about firearms in Britain, because Derek Bird had legally possessed the weapons used during the attack. Questions emerged about licensing procedures and background evaluations. Britain already maintained some of the strictest firearm laws in the world, particularly after previous mass shootings, such as Hungerford and Dunblane. Yet the Cumbria case demonstrated that even strong regulations cannot eliminate all risk when someone deteriorates psychologically while still maintaining legal access to weapons. Authorities reviewed firearm licensing systems and discussed whether additional safeguards or monitoring procedures were necessary. At the same time, officials were cautious about making reactive policy decisions unsupported by evidence. The challenge lay in balancing rural gun ownership traditions, particularly involving shotguns used for lawful purposes, with public concerns about preventing future violence. Another major topic during the aftermath involved mental health and social isolation, especially in rural communities. Investigators had uncovered evidence suggesting Derek Bird's psychological condition had worsened significantly before the shootings. He reportedly became increasingly paranoid, withdrawn, and distrustful of those around him. Yet many people who interacted with him apparently did not believe he represented a danger capable of mass murder. That gap between visible distress and catastrophic violence sparked broader conversations across Britain about recognizing psychological decline before it escalates in a crisis. Still, authorities and commentators alike faced a delicate balance. There was concern about unfairly stigmatizing mental illness by linking it too directly with violence. Most individuals experiencing depression, anxiety, paranoia, or emotional isolation never harm anyone. The Cumbria shootings reflected not one simple issue, but a convergence of personal collapse, unresolved grievances, access to firearms, and social disconnection. Reducing the tragedy to a single explanation risked misunderstanding it entirely. The official conclusions also addressed the police response during the shootings. Investigators acknowledged the extraordinary difficulty of managing a mobile gunman moving across a large rural area. Cumbria's geography complicated response times and coordination. Armed officers had to navigate multiple locations while information changed constantly through emergency calls and witness reports. In the years following the attack, British policing agencies studied the Cumbria response carefully as part of broader efforts to improve strategies for handling rapidly moving active shooter situations. The term mobile shooter gained particular importance because Bird's ability to travel continuously between towns had created unique operational challenges. Despite the tragedy's scale, many observers noted the remarkable efforts of emergency responders and local communities during the crisis. Ambulance crews, police officers, medical staff, and civilians all faced extraordinary circumstances that morning. Some residents helped injured victims before emergency services arrived. Others sheltered frightened strangers inside homes and businesses while the shootings continued. In the aftermath, these acts of compassion became important counterweights to the violence itself. They reminded communities that even during moments of terror, human beings still move instinctively toward helping one another. As months passed, official reports gradually gave shape to the broader public understanding of the case. Authorities concluded there was no evidence whatsoever that the shootings were connected to terrorism or organized political extremism. This distinction mattered greatly in public discussion. Derek Bird's actions emerged from personal psychological collapse rather than ideological violence. He acted alone. No network existed behind the attacks. No political objective drove the killings. The horror came from the opposite reality. One isolated individual carrying private resentment and instability into public destruction. Yet for all the investigative conclusions and official findings, many emotional questions remained unresolved. Families of victims still faced ordinary absences that statistics and reports could never adequately describe. Empty chairs at family gatherings, unanswered phone calls, birthdays that arrived differently after loss. In true crime narratives, there is often pressure to search for closure. But cases like Cumbria resist neat endings. The death of Derek Bird closed the legal chapter quickly, yet emotional consequences continued indefinitely. Survivors carried memories of gunfire and panic. Witnesses replayed moments they wished they could forget. Entire towns inherited a permanent before and after line in their collective history. The inquiry ultimately provided structure to the facts. But structure is not the same thing as resolution. One of the lasting impressions left by the Cumbria shootings is how profoundly ordinary the setting remained even after extraordinary violence. These were not places previously associated with national tragedy. They were quiet towns and roads where daily life had once felt predictable. The attacks shattered that predictability, forcing communities to confront the unsettling reality that catastrophic violence can emerge not only from distant threats, but from familiar individuals living quietly nearby. In the absence of a courtroom trial, the official findings became the closest thing Britain would receive to an explanation. They painted the picture of a man deteriorating under psychological strain, consumed by paranoia and resentment, ultimately collapsing into violence that spread far beyond its original personal targets. But even the most detailed investigation could not fully answer the central human question that lingered over Cumbria long after June 2nd. 2010. How does an ordinary life deteriorate so completely that it ends with 12 innocent people dead across the roads of a peaceful English county? In the years after the Cumbria shootings, life across the county slowly resumed its outward rhythm. Roads reopened. Shops continued operating. Taxi drivers returned to their routes. Tourists once again traveled through the green landscapes and coastal towns that had long defined the region. From a distance, Cumbria appeared peaceful again, almost unchanged. But communities that experience sudden mass violence are never restored completely to what they were before. The visible signs disappear first. Police tape comes down. News cameras leave. Headlines fade for national attention. Yet beneath ordinary routines, memory remains embedded in places, in conversations, and in the private lives of survivors and families who continue carrying the weight of what happened on June 2nd. 2010. For many people outside Cumbria, the shootings eventually became another historical tragedy filed alongside earlier British mass shootings, such as Hungerford and Dunblane. But within the county itself, the event settled into local memory differently. Residents remembered where they were when they first heard about the attacks. They remembered the confusion of that morning, the flood of emergency vehicles, The phone calls checking whether loved ones were safe. In small communities, tragedy becomes personal very quickly because connections overlap everywhere. A victim is not simply a name in a report. He might be a neighbor, a customer, a relative, a familiar face seen every week in town. The emotional geography of loss spreads outward through entire communities. One of the lasting consequences of the Cumbria shootings was the way they reshaped perceptions of safety in rural Britain. For decades, many people viewed places like Cumbria as insulated from the kinds of violence associated with larger cities or other countries. The county represented quietness, routine, and distance from national turmoil. The shootings shattered that psychological assumption. They demonstrated that catastrophic violence does not always emerge from visibly dangerous environments. Sometimes it comes from familiar roads, familiar towns, and familiar people. That realization carried particular emotional force because Derek Byrd himself had once been part of the ordinary fabric of local life. He was not an outsider entering the county with a political agenda or organized plan. He was a local taxi driver known to many residents by face, if not by name. The fact that the violence emerged from someone so ordinary forced communities to confront uncomfortable questions about how well people truly know one another. After the shootings, British authorities continued reviewing firearm licensing procedures and emergency response strategies. Because Byrd legally possessed the weapons used in the attacks, discussions intensified around how authorities assess firearm ownership, particularly when individuals display signs of psychological instability or emotional deterioration. Yet the challenge remained deeply complex. Rural firearm ownership in Britain often exists within lawful traditions connected to farming, sport shooting, or pest control. Most gun owners never commit violence. The difficulty lies in recognizing the rare moments when personal collapse intersects dangerously with access to weapons. The Cumbria case became part of broader national conversations about prevention, not because it offered simple answers, but because it exposed how difficult prediction can be. Authorities also placed greater emphasis on preparing police forces for incidents involving mobile shooters. The geography of the Cumbria attack revealed serious operational challenges. Derek Byrd had moved continuously across roads and towns, making it difficult for armed officers to contain him quickly. In response, police agencies examined communication systems, deployment strategies, and rapid coordination procedures for future incidents involving fast-moving suspects across large areas. These changes reflected one of the painful realities of modern emergency planning. Major tragedies often reshape public policy precisely because they expose vulnerabilities that previously seemed hypothetical. Yet while institutional lessons mattered, the deeper legacy of shootings remained human rather than procedural. Survivors and witnesses carried memories that no policy reform could erase. Some people reportedly struggled with anxiety long afterward. Others found ordinary experiences transformed by fear. The sound of sudden loud noises, the sight of certain roads, passing taxis resembling Byrd's vehicle. Trauma rarely remains confined to the original event. It extends into ordinary life through memory and anticipation. Even when physical danger disappears, the nervous system continues reacting as though threat might return. Families of victims faced a different kind of permanence. Public memorials and anniversaries acknowledged collective grief. But private grief unfolds quietly over years. There are birthdays without phone calls, holidays interrupted by absence, daily routines altered permanently by the loss of someone who once occupied ordinary spaces in family life. One of the most painful aspects of sudden violence is its incompleteness. Conversations remain unfinished. Plans vanish abruptly. People leave home expecting to return later that day, unaware that routine itself is about to disappear. In Cumbria, 12 families experienced that irreversible rupture. There is also an enduring psychological tension in cases like this between explanation and understanding. Investigators identified many factors contributing to Derek Bird's collapse: paranoia, financial anxiety, isolation, interpersonal conflict, emotional deterioration. But identifying factors is not the same as fully understanding how one human being arrives at the decision to kill strangers across an entire county. That gap matters because society often searches for explanations that restore a sense of order. People want reassurance that tragedies can be clearly predicted or neatly prevented. The Cumbria shootings resist that comfort. Derek Bird was troubled, but many troubled people never become violent. He was isolated, but isolation alone does not create murderers. The case forces an uncomfortable acknowledgement that human behavior sometimes deteriorates in ways that remain partially unknowable even after extensive investigation. In the years following the attack, commentators and mental health advocates also reflected on loneliness and psychological decline in rural communities. Isolation can deepen quietly in places where emotional struggles remain hidden behind routine. A person continues working, continues moving through daily life, continues appearing outwardly functional while internally becoming more detached from reality and from other people. The Cumbria shootings became part of wider conversations about how communities recognize emotional collapse before it reaches catastrophic levels. Yet those conversations also carry caution. Most isolated individuals are not dangerous. Most people struggling psychologically never harm anyone. Reducing mass violence solely to mental illness risks both misunderstanding tragedy and unfairly stigmatizing millions of nonviolent people living with mental health conditions. The legacy of Cumbria therefore exists within complexity rather than certainty. The attack was neither entirely inexplicable nor entirely explainable. It emerged from the convergence of personal grievance, emotional deterioration, access to firearms, and profound isolation. But even together, those elements do not create a formula capable of predicting future violence with confidence. Perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes the case linger so powerfully in British memory. It challenged assumptions not only about public safety, but about ordinary human familiarity. How well can we truly know the people around us? At what point does private despair become public danger? And how many warning signs become visible only after tragedy forces people to look backward, searching for meaning? Over time, the media attention faded, as it always does. New tragedies replaced old ones in public conversation. But Cumbria itself continued living alongside the memory of what happened. Memorials remained. Families remembered anniversaries. Survivors carried invisible injuries into future years. The county did not become defined solely by violence, but the shootings became permanently woven into its history. And perhaps that is one of the most important truths about communities after trauma. They continue. Not because grief disappears, but because life does. Children still grow up. Roads still fill with morning traffic. Shops reopen. Conversations return to ordinary subjects. Yet beneath that continuity exists an awareness that normal life can fracture unexpectedly and permanently. In many ways, the Cumbria shootings represented the collision between two realities. The first was the peaceful image of rural England, a place of familiarity, routine, and quiet landscapes. The second was the hidden instability of one isolated man deteriorating internally while remaining outwardly ordinary. On June 2nd, 2010, those realities collided violently across the roads of Cumbria. The aftermath left behind more than statistics or policy discussions. It left questions about loneliness, about unnoticed suffering, about the fragility of ordinary life. and about how quickly familiarity can transform into fear. Today, the roads through Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale, and the surrounding countryside look much as they did before the shootings. Cars pass through them every day. People continue living their lives beside the same hills and coastlines that existed long before. Derek Bird entered his taxi that morning. The landscape endured. But for those who lived through the events of June 2010, certain places can never feel entirely ordinary again. Somewhere along those roads are memories of sirens, confusion, locked doors, frightened phone calls, and sudden silence after gunfire. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire case is how ordinary it all began. No dramatic declaration announced the beginning of the tragedy. No obvious warning interrupted the quiet morning air. There was only a taxi driver moving through familiar roads in a county that believed violence like this happened somewhere else. To someone else, until suddenly it happened there. If there is a final way to understand the Cumbria shootings, it does not come from a courtroom verdict or a single explanatory statement, because neither of those ever existed in this case. It comes instead from the uneasy space left behind when all official processes are complete. When investigations have ended, reports have been written, and what remains is only memory. On June 2nd, 2010, Derek Bird moved through Cumbria in a taxi carrying firearms. And by the end of that day, 12 people were dead and 11 others injured. The legal system could confirm what happened, but could not fully answer why it happened in a way that satisfied the human need for clarity. That gap between facts and understanding is where the legacy of this case continues to live. In the years after the shootings, Cumbria returned to its quiet rhythm, but it did so with an altered awareness. Rural life, once associated with safety through familiarity, now carried a subtle awareness that familiarity itself is not always protective. People still knew their neighbors, still greeted taxi drivers, still walked the same roads and entered the same shops. But there was a new layer of reflection beneath those actions. The idea that someone known, someone ordinary, could become the center of catastrophic violence had permanently changed how some residents understood their own communities. This is one of the most difficult psychological consequences of events like the Cumbria shootings. They do not only take lives, they reshape perception. The landscape remains physically unchanged, but its emotional meaning shifts. Whitehaven, Egremont, Seascale, and the surrounding roads of Cumbria are still geographically the same places they were before 2010. Yet for those who lived through that day, certain stretches of road carry invisible weight. Memory attaches itself to physical space in ways that are often permanent. A bend in a road, a quiet junction, a stretch of pavement outside a shop can become markers of a moment when ordinary time fractured into something unrecognizable. For the families of victims, there is no return to a version of life before June 2nd. The absence created by the shootings is not temporary or symbolic. It is structural. It becomes part of the architecture of daily life. Birthdays are marked differently. Holidays carry silence where voices once existed. Conversations continue around the absence rather than through it. Over time, grief does not necessarily diminish, it changes form, becoming something that coexists with routine rather than something that disappears from it. In the wider public consciousness, the Cumbria shootings gradually became part of a small group of British mass casualty events that are often referenced together. Hungerford in 1987, Dunblane in 1996, and Cumbria in 2010. Each case is different in motive, context, and setting, but together they shape a national understanding of rare but devastating acts of mass violence. In each instance, the United Kingdom was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about firearms, prevention, and the limits of prediction. Yet Cumbria also stands apart because of its mobility, its geographical spread. and the absence of any ideological framework. It was not an attack on a specific institution or group. It was a collapse that moved across a landscape. That mobility made it harder to contain in real time and harder to categorize afterward. From an investigative perspective, the case reinforced several lessons about how quickly violence can escalate when psychological deterioration intersects with access to lethal means. Authorities examined how Derek Bird, a legally registered firearm owner, had been able to maintain access to weapons despite signs of emotional instability and growing paranoia. At the same time, officials were careful not to reduce the case to a single policy failure, because the reality was more complex than any one system could fully account for. The intersection of legal ownership, rural geography, personal isolation, and mental decline created a situation that was not easily anticipated through standard risk models. For law enforcement, the case also became a reference point for understanding mobile active shooter incidents. Unlike contained attacks in single locations, Bird's movements across Cumbria required simultaneous responses in multiple areas, with limited information and rapidly evolving conditions. This challenged traditional coordination models and highlighted the importance of communication speed, aerial surveillance, and flexible deployment strategies. In later reviews, these operational difficulties were studied not as failures in isolation, but as structural challenges inherent in responding to fast-moving threats in rural environments. Yet beyond institutional analysis, the most enduring aspect of the Cumbria shootings remains human rather than procedural. Survivors and witnesses carry experiences that do not fully align with official timelines or investigative summaries. Memory does not always follow sequence. It returns in fragments: the sound of a shot, the sight of a vehicle slowing, the sudden shift from ordinary mourning to irreversible fear. These fragments do not fade easily because they are tied to moments when perception itself changed. One of the most haunting qualities reported by witnesses was the calmness attributed to Derek Bird during the attacks. That detail appears repeatedly in accounts, not because it provides explanation, but because it disrupts expectation. Violence is often imagined as chaotic and emotionally visible. Yet here it was described as controlled, quiet, almost procedural. That contradiction contributes to why the case remains so psychologically unsettling even years later. There's also the broader question of how communities remember individuals like Derek Bird. In public narrative, he is defined by the worst actions of his life, as is inevitable in cases of mass violence. But within local memory, there is often a tension between the person who was known and the person who became the perpetrator of tragedy. He was a taxi driver in Whitehaven, a familiar presence in a small community, someone who existed within everyday routines before becoming associated with irreversible harm. That duality does not excuse or explain the violence, but it does reflect the complexity of how human lives are perceived before and after catastrophic events. Over time, national attention moved on, as it always does. News stories replaced old headlines. Public discourse shifted toward other crises. Yet within Cumbria, anniversaries of the shootings continued to be marked quietly. Not with spectacle, but with remembrance. Names were spoken. Silence was observed. The act of remembering itself became a form of continuity, a way of acknowledging that while life moved forward, certain days remained fixed in collective memory. Perhaps the most important reflection that emerges from the Cumbria shootings is not about how rare such events are, but about how they are embedded in ordinary conditions. There was no external invasion, no distant force arriving from outside the system. The violence emerged from within the same landscape where ordinary life was taking place. That reality forces a difficult form of reflection, that stability in any community is not absolute, and that beneath visible routine there can exist private struggles that remain unseen until they manifest in irreversible ways. In the end, the Cumbria shootings remain difficult to fully conclude because they resist narrative closure. The investigation ended. The gunman died. The legal questions were resolved. But the human questions remain open in a different sense, not because answers do not exist, but because no answer can fully restore what was lost or fully explain what occurred in a way that removes its emotional weight. What remains is a county that continues to live, a group of families who continue to remember, and a date, June 2nd, 2010, that marks a permanent divide between before and after. And somewhere within that divide lies the most enduring truth of the case. That ordinary life can contain extraordinary fragility, and that sometimes the most devastating events do not arrive with warning, but unfold quietly within the familiar world until there's no longer any distinction between the place people thought they knew and the tragedy that happened within it.